Story 1. The Silent Stalker of Willow Creek. I've always been an avid hiker. There's something therapeutic about the wilderness, about being alone with your thoughts and the sounds of nature. I've spent countless days trekking through forests, climbing mountains, and navigating rough terrains. But I had no idea that one innocent hike would change my life forever. It was mid-September, and the weather was perfect for a long, solitary hike. The trees around Willow Creek were just beginning to change, their leaves tinged with gold and red. The trail I planned to take was one I'd done before. Nothing too treacherous, but long enough to be a challenge. It weaved through thick forests and crossed over small streams before leading up to a scenic overlook. The first few hours were peaceful. I didn't see anyone on the trail, which I preferred. I loved the quiet, the isolation, and the feeling of being far from the noise of civilization. The only sounds were the crunch of leaves beneath my boots, the calls of distant birds, and the rush of the creek as it tumbled over rocks. As I approached a particularly dense thicket, something strange caught my eye. A figure, a tall, thin figure, standing motionless among the trees. I thought it was just another hiker at first, maybe someone who had stopped to rest, but something felt off. This person, if it even was a person, was unnaturally tall. Its limbs were too long, its body too slender. I couldn't make out much more of its features because it was shrouded in shadow, but there was something wrong about its presence. I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart racing. I tried to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but the figure remained perfectly still, staring at me from between the trees. I could feel its gaze on me, even though I couldn't see its eyes. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in place. Time seemed to stretch and bend. Finally, I forced myself to look away, taking a deep breath and continuing down the trail, my pace quickening. But that figure, it never left my mind. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting it to be there, watching me, but I never saw it again. I tried to shake off the feeling, blaming it on the isolation and the fact that I'd been hiking for hours without much rest. That night, I set up camp by the creek. The fire crackled and popped, sending sparks into the dark sky. I felt a strange sense of unease, something that had nothing to do with the wilderness itself. It was as if something was watching me, just beyond the edge of the firelight. The thought made my skin crawl, but I forced myself to relax. I was being paranoid. Nothing was out there. Around midnight, I woke up to a noise. It wasn't the usual sounds of the forest. No rustling leaves, no calls from animals. This was something deliberate. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps, like someone walking around my camp. My heart pounded in my chest as I sat up, straining to hear. The footsteps came closer, then stopped. I grabbed my flashlight and flicked it on, pointing it toward the sound. Nothing. The area around my camp was empty. My mind raced. Was it just an animal? A bear, perhaps? But no, it didn't sound like an animal. The steps were too calculated, too human. I spent the rest of the night awake, my eyes scanning the darkness. But the footsteps didn't return, and I eventually managed to convince myself that it had been nothing. Some part of me, though, knew that I wasn't just imagining things. I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, had been out there. The next morning, I packed up my gear and started the hike back. I felt unsettled, like something was lurking just out of sight. Every rustle of leaves, every movement in the trees, made my heart skip a beat. The trail felt different now, more foreboding. I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see the tall figure from the day before. By the time I reached the end of the trail, I was exhausted, not physically, but mentally. The entire hike back had been a blur, my mind consumed with the thought of what I had seen and heard. I couldn't explain it. When I returned home, I told a few friends about the strange figure I had seen. They all brushed it off as a trick of the light, or maybe someone else on the trail. But as the days passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That feeling only intensified when I heard reports of strange sightings in the area. People describing encounters with a tall, thin figure lurking in the woods. Some called it Slenderman. I don't know what I saw that day, or what followed me home from Willow Creek, but I can never forget the feeling of being watched, being stalked, by something that wasn't human. and I know I'll never go hiking alone again. Story 2. The Cold Silence of Blackstone Forest. I've always found solace in the wilderness, especially when I'm hiking alone. It gives me a sense of freedom, being far from the hustle of daily life, surrounded only by nature. For me, the solitude is therapeutic. But that all changed on a cold October morning when I hiked through Blackstone Forest, a place known for its haunting beauty and eerie quiet. It started like any other hike. I had been planning this trip for weeks, a solo trek through the dense woods of Blackstone, a forest that stretched for miles, with narrow trails that wove through towering oaks and thick brush. The forest had a reputation for being peaceful during the day but unnerving at night. Local legends spoke of strange occurrences, disappearances, and strange sights, but I wasn't one to believe in ghost stories. I thought of them as nothing more than local folklore designed to scare off those who didn't respect the woods. I arrived early in the morning, the sun barely peeking over the horizon. The cool air carried the scent of pine and earth, and the only sounds were the chirping of birds and the rustling of leaves beneath my boots. As I ventured deeper into the forest, I began to feel that familiar sense of connection with nature. The path was mostly empty, as I expected. It was a weekday, and I rarely encountered other hikers on this trail. As I moved along, I lost track of time. My feet seemed to know the trail by heart, and I barely had to think about where I was going. After a few hours of walking, I found myself in a part of the forest I hadn't been to before. The trees were thicker here, their trunks gnarled and twisted, and the canopy blocked out most of the light. It felt darker, colder, even though it was still morning. The trail ahead of me narrowed into a faint path that seemed to disappear into the dense underbrush. I paused for a moment, my breath visible in the cool air. Something didn't feel right. I had hiked through remote areas before, but this place felt different. It was as if the forest was holding its breath, waiting. I shook off the unease and decided to push forward. As I moved deeper, the forest became unnaturally quiet. The usual sounds of wildlife, birds, squirrels, even the wind in the leaves, seemed to have disappeared. There was no rustling of branches or the distant call of a bird. It was just silent. The only sound was the crunch of dry leaves beneath my feet. That's when I first saw it. At first, it was just a flicker at the edge of my vision, something out of place. A tall figure, standing motionless among the trees. I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart leaping into my throat. The figure was unnaturally tall, its limbs long and spindly. It was too far to make out clearly, but I could see enough. Its body seemed to stretch unnaturally, its movements stiff and jerky. I blinked and rubbed my eyes, telling myself I was seeing things. But when I looked back, it was still there. The figure hadn't moved, but I could feel it watching me. There was an unsettling stillness about it, something that felt wrong. Its face was hidden by the shadows of the trees, and the longer I stared, the more the figure seemed to loom in my mind. I turned to leave, trying to calm myself. Maybe it was just some trick of the light, or perhaps another hiker, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Something about that figure, something about its presence, felt predatory, like it was waiting for me to make a move. I quickened my pace, walking faster and faster as if I could outrun the sensation. But the deeper I went into the forest, the more the feeling of being watched intensified. It was as if the trees themselves were closing in on me, the shadows growing longer, thicker. I started to hear sounds, distant, faint sounds, but not the usual sounds of the forest. These were deliberate, like someone moving through the underbrush, just out of sight. I tried to tell myself it was just an animal, perhaps a deer or a bear, but deep down, I knew something was off. The footsteps weren't random. They were too calculated, too human. I came to a small clearing and decided to stop for a break. I needed to gather myself and try to make sense of what I was feeling. I set my pack down and sat on a rock, my eyes scanning the trees. My instincts were telling me to leave, but part of me wanted to stay, to prove that there was nothing out there. That's when I heard the voice. It was faint at first, like a whisper carried on the wind, but there was no mistaking it. It was a voice, a human voice. It was distant, but it sounded almost too familiar, as though it was calling my name. My stomach dropped as the whisper grew louder, closer. My name echoed through the trees, but there was something wrong with the tone. Cold, hollow, as if the voice wasn't human. I stood up quickly, my heart racing, and looked around, but there was no one in sight. The trees were still, the forest silent once more. The whisper had stopped, but the eerie feeling remained. I grabbed my pack and began walking again, this time with purpose, every step feeling like it took me farther from safety. I made my way toward the trail, hoping to make it back to the main path, but the forest had changed. The trees were now larger, older, and twisted in unnatural shapes. The air had grown colder, and the light was dimmer, as if the sun was being swallowed by the canopy above. Then I saw it again, the figure, standing just ahead, its face still obscured by shadows. I froze, my blood running cold. This time, it wasn't motionless. It was moving toward me, slowly, deliberately. My legs refused to move, as if my body knew better than to run. And then, in a split second, I realized the figure wasn't human. It wasn't just a tall man standing in the woods. It was something far worse. Its limbs stretched unnaturally, longer than any human should be, and its skin seemed to ripple as though it were shifting. Its face remained featureless, a blank, pale canvas, except for the two black, hollow eyes that were fixed on me. Eyes that seemed to pierce through me, cold and empty. I don't know how long I stood there, paralyzed with fear. The creature's presence was suffocating, and I knew that if I stayed any longer, it would be the end of me. I turned and ran, this time with every ounce of strength in my body. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees pressing in on all sides, as if trying to trap me. But when I reached the trail, the figure was gone. I didn't stop to look back. I didn't stop until I reached the edge of the forest, where I could see the road in the distance. I collapsed on the ground, gasping for air, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't understand what had happened, what I had seen. The only thing I knew for sure was that whatever I had encountered in Blackstone Forest was real, and it wasn't something I could forget. Story 3. The Watcher of Eastbrook Pines. I've always enjoyed hiking as a way to clear my mind, to escape from the noise of daily life and reconnect with nature. The trails, the trees, the open skies, they give me peace. That's why I didn't hesitate when I decided to take a weekend trip to Eastbrook Pines, a remote part of the forest that had been on my list for years. It was far off the beaten path, and I'd heard rumors about strange happenings, but I didn't pay them much mind. People like to embellish stories, after all. It was a crisp morning in late autumn when I began my hike. The early frost had left a layer of ice on the ground, and the trees around me were a mix of bright orange and deep red. The trail was secluded, the kind of place where you wouldn't expect to see many people, and that was exactly why I loved it. I packed my backpack with essentials, water, snacks, a map, and my camera. I planned to take my time and soak in the beauty of the pines. The first few miles were peaceful. The only sounds were the crunch of my boots against the frozen earth and the occasional call of a bird. The trail wound through a dense thicket of pines, and the sun barely filtered through the canopy, casting the ground in patches of light and shadow. I was enjoying the solitude, but I couldn't ignore the strange feeling that something was watching me. It was subtle at first, just a sensation that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I told myself it was just my imagination. I was alone in the woods, after all, and my mind was bound to play tricks on me. But as I continued on, the feeling grew stronger. It wasn't just a vague sense of being watched. It was as if something was out there, deliberately keeping its distance, yet following me. I tried to dismiss it. I'd been in the woods countless times, and I knew there was no reason to be scared. But this time, something was different. The woods felt too still, too quiet. It was as if nature itself was holding its breath. I pushed forward, trying to shake off the unease. The trail began to curve around a bend, and as I rounded it, I saw something that made my heart stop. At first, I thought it was a person, standing at the edge of the path, just beyond the trees. But as I drew closer, I realized it wasn't human. The figure was unnaturally tall, its body stretched thin, its limbs too long, and its posture stiff. It was standing completely still, its back turned toward me. I couldn't make out any details. Its face was hidden in shadow, its body blending with the surrounding trees. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. My first instinct was to turn and run, but I couldn't move. I just stood there, staring at the figure, unable to tear my eyes away. I don't know how long I stood there, but it felt like an eternity. Then, the figure moved. Not in a natural way, but in an unnatural, jerky motion, as if its limbs were too long for its body to control. It took a slow step forward, and I instinctively took a step back. That's when I saw it, the blank, featureless face. It was as if the figure had no eyes, no mouth, no expression at all, just an empty, smooth surface where a face should have been. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as my body finally reacted. I turned and ran, faster than I've ever run in my life, not daring to look back. The path twisted and turned, and I couldn't hear anything except the pounding of my own footsteps. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. I could still feel the presence of that thing behind me, following, watching. The woods felt suffocating, as if the trees themselves were closing in, blocking my way. I was terrified, and for the first time, I realized that something in the forest wasn't right. I finally reached a clearing, my breath ragged and panicked. I paused for a moment, my heart racing, and looked around. The forest was silent again. I could see the sun beginning to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows across the ground, but there was no sign of the figure. I forced myself to calm down, telling myself it was a trick of the light, that I had imagined the whole thing. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The feeling of being watched hadn't gone away. If anything, it was stronger than ever. And just as I was about to continue on, I heard it, a whisper. Soft at first, just a murmur in the wind, but it grew louder, more distinct. It was my name. Someone, or something, was calling me. I spun around, searching the clearing, but saw nothing. The trees were empty, the path ahead clear. My heart raced as I realized the voice was coming from the trees behind me. I turned to face them, my eyes scanning the darkening woods. That's when I saw it again, the figure. It was standing just beyond the clearing, watching me. It had moved without a sound, appearing in the shadows as if it had always been there, waiting. My breath caught in my throat. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, staring at me with its blank, featureless face. I didn't wait to see what it would do next. I turned and ran, not caring about the trail or where it led. I just needed to get out of the woods. The voice, the figure, the overwhelming sense of dread. It was too much to bear. I ran until I reached the edge of the forest, my heart hammering in my chest. Only then did I stop, gasping for air, my body trembling. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I knew that whatever I had encountered in Eastbrook Pines was real. It wasn't just a figment of my imagination. Something had been following me, something that shouldn't exist. I haven't returned to Eastbrook Pines since that day. I don't know what I saw out there, but I can't forget the feeling of being watched, of being stalked by something that wasn't human. And I know that whatever it was, it's still out there, waiting for the next hiker to cross its path. Story 4. The Silent Woods of Black Hollow. I've been a hiker for most of my life. Growing up, the woods were my playground. I spent every spare moment I had exploring the forests near my home, from the dense hardwoods to the towering pines, each trail holding its own mystery. I had never encountered anything truly terrifying, until the day I ventured into Black Hollow. Black Hollow is a remote area, known for its eerie stillness and isolation. It's a place where few venture, and even fewer return from. Most hikers avoid it, preferring the more accessible and well-trodden paths nearby. The locals have always spoken of it with an air of caution, claiming that strange things happen in the forest. People go in, but they often don't come out the same. I had always brushed these stories off as superstition, chalking it up to local folklore and the overactive imaginations of people who didn't understand the wilderness like I did. It was a warm spring day when I decided to hike into Black Hollow. I'd heard the stories, but I didn't believe in them. I wanted to see the place for myself, to prove that it was just another stretch of forest. So, With my pack loaded with essentials, I set off for the trailhead. The forest was quiet as I entered. The trees were thick and gnarled, their roots twisted into the earth like ancient veins. The path was narrow, and the further I walked, the darker the woods became. The canopy overhead blocked out much of the light, casting the forest floor in a perpetual twilight. It felt almost unnatural, as if the trees themselves were watching me. But I pressed on, telling myself it was just the isolation, the lack of sunlight, that gave the woods a strange atmosphere. As I walked deeper into Black Hollow, I began to notice that the usual sounds of the forest were missing. No birdsong, no rustling of animals in the underbrush. The only sound was the crunch of leaves beneath my boots. The silence was suffocating, as if the entire forest was holding its breath. I tried to shake off the unease that crept over me. I had hiked in much darker, quieter places before, but this felt different. There was something about the stillness that was too complete, too unnatural. I glanced around, expecting to see some sign of life, but the forest seemed devoid of movement, as if the woods had been abandoned long ago. Then, I saw it. At the edge of the path, just beyond the trees, there was a figure. At first, I thought it was a person, perhaps another hiker, but as I drew closer, I realized that it wasn't human. It was tall, taller than any person I had ever seen, and its body was unnaturally thin, almost skeletal. Its limbs stretched out at odd angles, like they were too long for its body. But it was the face, or lack of one, that truly unsettled me. Where a face should have been, there was only a smooth, featureless surface, as white as bone, a blank, empty canvas. I stopped dead in my tracks, my breath caught in my throat. I couldn't look away. The figure stood completely still, like it was waiting for something, or someone. My heart pounded in my chest, and my mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Was this some sort of prank? A person in a costume? But no, there was something about it that felt wrong. This wasn't a costume. This wasn't human. It didn't move, didn't even acknowledge my presence. But I could feel its gaze, even though I couldn't see its eyes. It was as if it was watching me, studying me, waiting. I took a step back, my instincts screaming at me to run, but my body wouldn't cooperate. I was frozen, unable to look away from the figure. The silence around me grew oppressive, heavy, like the forest itself was closing in. My skin crawled, and my heartbeat seemed to reverberate through my body. I knew I needed to leave, but my legs refused to move. And then, the figure shifted. It didn't move like a person. Its movements were unnatural, jerky, as if its limbs were not entirely in sync with the rest of its body. It took a step forward, its long arms hanging at its sides, its body swaying slightly. I could hear the rustle of leaves beneath its feet, but it didn't make a sound. It was as if the creature had no weight, no presence, except for the overwhelming sense of dread it exuded. Without thinking, my body finally responded. I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The air around me felt thick, suffocating, like something was following me, just out of sight, always a step behind. I could hear footsteps, slow, deliberate, but distant. It was as though the creature was toying with me, letting me think I had a chance to escape before it closed in. I didn't stop running until I reached the edge of the forest, my legs aching, my lungs burning. I collapsed onto the ground, gasping for air, my heart still racing. I looked back, expecting to see the figure emerging from the trees, but there was nothing. The forest was still. I spent the rest of the day in a daze, unsure of what I had just experienced. The figure, the thing in the woods, was real. It wasn't some trick of the mind or a figment of my imagination. It was something that shouldn't have been there. And it wasn't just in Black Hollow. It was out there, somewhere, watching. I haven't returned to Black Hollow since that day, and I have no plans to. The feeling of being stalked, of being hunted, has stayed with me. The woods hold secrets, and I've learned that some places are better left unexplored. Whatever I encountered in Black Hollow is still out there. Story 5. The Long Road to Hollow's End. I never intended to go to Hollow's End. It was a place whispered about in the small towns scattered around the foothills, a place you were told to avoid. Old legends told of strange things happening in the area, hikers going missing, strange lights in the sky, and creatures seen in the woods that didn't belong. Most people dismissed it as local superstition, but I wasn't most people. I'm a hiker, and the more I heard about the place, the more I wanted to see it for myself. The day I set out for Hollow's End was cool, with overcast skies threatening rain. I'd packed my usual hiking gear, a backpack with water, snacks, a map, and a flashlight. I wasn't expecting anything out of the ordinary, just another solitary hike through the woods. But as I drove closer to the trailhead, the air seemed to change. It was subtle at first, a slight heaviness in the atmosphere, but as I parked my car and began walking into the woods, the air grew thicker, colder, and the sounds of the forest seemed to vanish. I'd heard that Hollow's End was a secluded part of the forest, difficult to access, and few people who ventured in ever came back to tell their tales. It was as if the place itself was a trap, pulling people in and keeping them there. But I didn't believe in that kind of thing. I thought it was all just exaggeration. There had to be a rational explanation. The first few miles were uneventful. The forest around me was quiet, the kind of silence that's almost unnatural. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of a forest in the early morning. It was something more oppressive, as if the trees themselves were listening, waiting. The deeper I went into the woods, the more I noticed the strange lack of animal sounds. No birds, no rustling in the underbrush, just the eerie stillness of a place that felt wrong. By the time I reached the edge of Hollow's End, I was already feeling on edge. The trees here were larger, their trunks gnarled and twisted, their branches reaching out like fingers trying to grab hold of anything that came too close. The ground was uneven, covered in thick moss and fallen leaves, and the path had long since disappeared. I had to rely on my map and compass, but something told me that the map didn't matter. There was something about this place that felt like it existed outside the boundaries of the world I knew. As I moved deeper into Hollow's End, the unease in my chest grew. I couldn't explain it, but I knew I wasn't alone. Every so often, I would hear the faintest sound, footsteps, maybe, or a whisper carried by the wind. But when I stopped and listened, there was nothing there. I shook it off, telling myself it was just my imagination running wild. But then, as the sun began to set and the shadows lengthened, I saw it. At first, it was just a flash of movement in the trees, but then it stopped. There, standing among the trunks, was a figure. Tall, impossibly tall, and far too thin. Its limbs stretched out at unnatural angles, its body twisting in ways that no human body should. And its face, if it even had a face, was hidden in shadow, smooth and featureless. I stood frozen, staring at it, my heart pounding in my chest. For a moment, I thought I was seeing things. My mind was playing tricks on me. But then the figure moved. It didn't walk, didn't even seem to take a step. It just glided, floating toward me with a slow, deliberate motion, its long arms reaching out as though it were beckoning me to come closer. I tried to move, but my legs wouldn't respond. I wanted to run, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from it. The air around me felt heavy, suffocating. I felt as though I was being drawn in, unable to escape. My breath caught in my throat as the figure stopped just short of me, its presence overwhelming. I could feel the cold, an unnatural chill that seemed to emanate from it. And then, the whispering started. It was faint at first, just a murmur carried on the wind, but it grew louder, clearer. It was my name, repeated over and over, the voice cold and hollow, like it was coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Come closer," the voice whispered. I shook my head, trying to break free from whatever trance I was under. My heart was racing, my body trembling with fear. The figure took another step forward, its arms outstretched, its long fingers reaching for me. That was all I needed to snap out of it. I turned and ran, my feet pounding against the earth, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't dare look back. The sound of my heartbeat seemed to drown out everything else as I fled deeper into the woods, my mind screaming at me to get away. I didn't stop running until I reached the edge of the forest. My legs were on fire, and my lungs ached, but I didn't care. I had to get out of there. As I stumbled out into the open field, I dared to look back, half expecting to see the figure looming in the trees. But there was nothing. The forest was quiet once more. I don't know how long I stood there, trembling with fear, but eventually I forced myself to walk back to my car. I told a few friends about what I had seen, but they didn't believe me. They laughed it off as another overactive imagination fueled by the isolation of the woods. But I know what I saw. I know what I felt. I still couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me out of the woods. When I returned to my apartment, the weight of the encounter still hung over me, as if the figure in the forest had latched onto me like a shadow that wouldn't let go. The quiet hum of the city outside my window did nothing to calm the unease gnawing at my chest. I spent that night lying awake, staring at the ceiling, questioning everything I had seen. Could it have been a trick of the light? A hallucination brought on by exhaustion? The more I thought about it, the less sure I became of what was real. But deep down, I knew I had seen something I couldn't explain. It wasn't just the figure. It was the way the air had felt in Hollow's End, how every step seemed to echo in a silence that didn't make sense. It wasn't right. The next day, I tried to convince myself to move on. It had been just a one-off, an unsettling but harmless experience. But I couldn't. I kept replaying the encounter in my mind, feeling the cold presence of the figure, hearing the whisper of my name. I couldn't just forget it. After a week of restless nights, I returned to Hollow's End. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't want them to think I was crazy. I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that I had left something unfinished in that place, like a chapter of my life that refused to close. I drove out to the trailhead again, my stomach tight with a mix of dread and curiosity. The forest seemed to call to me, and I hated myself for answering. This time, I was more prepared, more aware of what could be out there. I carried a camera, extra supplies, and I told myself that I was going in with a level head, no longer thinking I was being followed by some supernatural entity. I was going in to face whatever it was that had unsettled me. But the moment I stepped into the woods, I knew something was wrong. The air felt thicker this time, heavier, like something was pressing down on me. The path seemed familiar, but it felt twisted, as though the woods themselves were shifting, changing. The trees looked like they were closing in around me, their branches stretching toward the sky as if trying to block the light. I walked further into the heart of Hollow's End, the silence more suffocating than ever. This time, I noticed things, small things that hadn't caught my attention before. There were scratch marks on the trunks of trees, deep gouges that looked too fresh to be from natural causes. I wasn't alone in the woods, I realized. I had never been alone. It wasn't long before I saw the figure again. It appeared in the same place as before, just beyond the trees. But this time it was different. It wasn't motionless. It was moving, slowly, deliberately, as if it were testing my reaction. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. This time, I didn't wait. I didn't give it a chance to approach. My instincts kicked in, and I turned and ran. I had to get away. I had to. The path blurred before me as I sprinted, the sound of my pounding feet filling my ears. I knew it was behind me, following me, its slow, methodical steps echoing in the distance. I ran for what felt like hours, but when I finally reached the clearing, I was gasping for air. I stopped for just a moment to catch my breath, my heart thudding in my chest. My hands were shaking, my legs barely able to hold me up. I glanced over my shoulder, expecting to see the figure close behind me. But there was nothing. The forest stood still, silent once more. I wanted to believe it was all in my head, that I was just too afraid, too caught up in my own fear to see things clearly. But as I stood there, catching my breath, I realized something terrible. I wasn't the one being hunted. I wasn't the one being followed. I was being watched. The feeling hit me all at once, sharp and cold. A chill ran down my spine as I slowly turned my head. There, at the far edge of the clearing, standing just out of the shadows, was the figure. It was closer now, much closer. It stood silently, its featureless face staring at me, the blank, smooth surface of its head reflecting the dim light of the late afternoon. It wasn't moving, but its presence was overwhelming, like a weight pressing down on me. I could feel it, the cold, unrelenting energy emanating from the thing in the forest. It wasn't just standing there. It was waiting. For me. I turned and ran again, not daring to look back this time. I didn't stop until I was back at the trailhead, my legs burning, my mind a whirlwind of panic and confusion. As I fumbled for my keys to unlock my car, I glanced back at the woods, half expecting to see the figure emerging from the trees, its long, twisted limbs stretching toward me. But nothing. The forest was still. The figure had vanished. I didn't stop driving until I reached the nearest town, and I haven't returned to Hollow's Inn since that day. Something in me tells me that it wasn't just a chance encounter. Whatever is in that forest is more than just a figment of my imagination. It's something ancient, something that's been waiting for the right person to come along, to wander too deep into the woods, to enter Hollow's End. And I know, deep down, that it's not done with me. Whatever it is, whatever it was, I'm still its prey. It's out there, waiting, watching, and I'm afraid it's never going to let me go.